So thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion on cannabis and livelihoods in Africa. Is it a risk or an opportunity? And before I hand over to my colleague, Inideli Adedeji, today, who's going to be chairing this discussion, I would like to introduce myself and just offer a few reflections on why this event is important for us at NatCen International. So again, I welcome you all. My name is Shireen El-Tarbulsi McCarthy, and I'm the director of NatCen International, which is a global social policy program at the National Center for Social Research. Now, at NatCen International, we engage with a broad set of global social policy issues such as health, governance, economic growth, gender and social inclusivity. And very much informing all our work is a focus on bridging global and local expertise. We're also very keen to hold interesting and thought-provoking conversations like the conversation that we're holding today. Now, as I said, I just want to kick off the discussion with 3 points of reflection on why addressing cannabis and livelihoods is an important social policy problem for governments and societies alike, and is an area that we are keen at NatCen International to engage with further. Now, and then I will hand over to Ini to introduce our excellent panel. Now, the first reason is because cannabis, beyond the dichotomous view of it, either as a crop or an illicit drug, is really fundamentally a multidimensional and multifaceted issue. It is a space where political violence, forms of economic exploitation, social inequality, inequities between northern and southern powers, and also environmental degradation are all quite visible. The second reason why this agenda or this research area is important is because policymaking on cannabis continues to reveal many of the problems of global social policy today. It continues to be very much fragmented, decontextualized, short-sighted, and very much focused on the immediate rather than long-term gains. And as the speakers would surely mention, that the policymaking we've witnessed today towards decriminalizing cannabis has actually contributed to the disenfranchisement and exclusion of low-wage workers in favor of big northern companies and governments accumulating wealth by dispossessing, citizens and people in the global south. And this is not the first time that we've seen this happen. The third reason why I think this conversation is really important today is that it shows the importance of, cannabis shows us the importance of situating policies in time. And I think this is an area of particular importance for me personally, for the research I conducted previously, but also for us as a program, to recognize that global social policy work continues to be very much agnostic to history and time. And current inequalities that we're witnessing today are very much an extension of the colonial past, and there's a need to understand the power dynamics that underpin cannabis policies in both the global north, the global south, and everywhere in between. As I mentioned before, NatCen International is very much committed to embedding our analysis in the lived experiences and the contexts that we are examining. And this conversation that we're having today is very much in the spirit of our guiding approach. Now, at this point, I will hand over to my colleague, Inideli Adedeji, to lead and chair the discussion. Over to you, Ini.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shireen. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Cannabis has for decades held a negative perception and correlation with criminality, rascality, and many other vices in various parts of Africa. In tandem with the stigmatization around the drug has been the implementation of severe criminal sentences for the possession of cannabis across several countries beyond the African continent. This has in turn rendered the livelihoods of various rural communities, most of whom are low-income households, where cannabis is cultivated, precarious. However, the status of cannabis is gradually beginning to change across the globe from illegal to legal, especially in parts of the global south, with the legalization of its sale by approved dispensers in countries such as the USA and Canada. There appears to be a reverberating effect of this in Africa as well, with increased calls within the political sphere for the legalization of cannabis and the decriminalization of its possession. The presidential candidature of George Wajakoya in the upcoming Kenyan elections due to take place in August this year is, for me, one of the most immediate among a number of examples of this discourse. As such, this event is, and the conversations we're supposed to have here today are a timely, much needed conversation. Today's discussion is focused on addressing 4 questions. The first is, what has been the impact of cannabis criminalization legislations on livelihoods in various parts of Africa? The second is, what can domestic and international actors do to protect livelihoods? The third is, and this is in particular relation to the research project being undertaken by our speakers today. What is the policy relevance of your research? And the final one is, what are the ethical difficulties with conducting research on cannabis, and how do you navigate around these issues? Joining me in this discussion today are 3 very distinguished speakers. Gernot Kleinschnick is Associate Professor in International Criminology at the School for Policy Studies at the University of Bristol. His research focuses on the history and politics of drugs and drug policy, pharmaceutical markets, and policing in West Africa. He's also the author of Crime, Drugs, and the State in Africa, and Africa and the War on Drugs, co-authored with Neil Carrier. He is the principal investigator of 2 ESRC projects on the hidden narratives of illicit livelihoods in West Africa and on cannabis and development in Africa. Simon Howell is a research fellow in the Global Risk Governance Program at the University of Cape Town. His primary research areas include drugs, gangs, violence, and general mayhem. His previous research has explored the relationship between justice and violence and marginalized people's identities. He has previously conducted research focusing on teenage mothers, township youth, drug users, gangsters, and police officials. Clement Rusinga is a research associate at the School for Policy Studies, also at the University of Bristol, and he's a researcher on the Cannabis Africana project. His research focuses on land and agrarian development, livelihoods, and the nexus between drugs, land policy, and development. And finally, we're also joined by Max Gallian, who will act as our discussant during today's event. Max Gallian is a political scientist who specializes in the politics of informal and illegal economies, smuggling, the political economy of development, and North African politics. Max is currently a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies and at the International Center for Tax and Development. I'm very honored to be joined by these fantastic panelists. Our first speaker will be Gernot, who will introduce us to the Cannabis Africana project before delving into the varying perceptions, statuses of cannabis and its historical development as a cash crop and important part of rural livelihoods in Nigeria. After Gernot, Simon will focus on South Africa, looking at the criminal justice system and the history of policing in tandem with the history of cannabis to explore their convergence and departure points. And then finally, the last speaker, Clemens, will discuss the history of cannabis in Zimbabwe and the effects of changing legislations and state policies on cannabis-linked livelihoods in Zimbabwe and the wider African continent. I'll now hand over the floor to Gernot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ini and Sherin, for inviting us. I think we are just sharing our presentation now, then I'll get going. Perfect. So I think you have already said so much about our project anyway, so I don't have much left to say, actually. But What I wanted to do really briefly is just talk about the project as a whole. It's still in the early stages, so we are really happy for any ideas, input from anyone, and very happy to have Max on the panel as well for his inputs, and then talk a little bit about Nigeria. Can I have my first slide, Clemens, please, or the next slide? So I think the speakers have already been introduced, the ones that work on the team. We have a group of people based at Bristol and the University of Cape Town especially, and at other institutions in the countries that we look at. But the key thing really to say is that this is a group of people that work in a very interdisciplinary kind of way, partly because Shireen already mentioned that drugs are very difficult to grasp phenomenon. You know, you need to look at them from very disciplines. So we have got people that are criminologists, agrarian experts, anthropologists, and historians on the project to really make sense of it. And still, I think we are missing probably some aspects to understand those drugs. Can I have the next slide, Clemens, please? So what I wanted to do now very briefly is talk about the project. You know, it's a ESRC and HRC funded project that's supposed to be 3 years long, but because of the pandemic, it will be extended to an extra year, hopefully. And we are currently in the sort of middle, sort of early still planning stage, but in the second year of our project, and we are just about to go on field work. So a lot of the things that we talk about are kind of still the plans rather than how things will work out based on our work. But what the project essentially tries to do and has always tried to do, and that, you know, it has to, because the project was designed, actually, I think we worked on the proposal in 2000, I think at least 6 or 7 years ago. So things have changed in the meantime, but the original focus was always to bring drugs and development together and to see to basically find out what the place of cannabis is in rural and urban livelihoods in different African countries. So that was the sort of the main question or idea. And the idea was also to find out what kind of role it plays in socioeconomic development. And I have to say that the sort of, based on our past research, because all of us had worked on drugs already before this project, we had a sort of idea that probably cannabis doesn't play that role that development planners, that state officials usually wanted to play, or that so it's often seen as a very anti-development crop, actually. And what we are suggesting is that it still provides livelihoods for people as an almost subversive type of development for people. So that's the frame that we are trying to take, how drugs and development work together. And what we sort of try to do is sort of go beyond state thinking of development, obviously, with this kind of lens. But 4 main objectives that the project has is, one, I think that Shireen already mentioned, this idea that we want to go beyond this immediate focus of much of the policy research on cannabis, you know, and on drugs more generally. Drugs are often seen as a major problem at the moment, and sorry, I still need the old slide. Whereas they have often a long history and are very embedded in different societies. So the project aims to look to that historical grounding of cannabis, and it has a very different histories in the different places and even within the different countries or different regions that we look at. But again, the idea is to challenge this presentism in much of the research. We also try to understand, as I already said, this contemporary place and utility of cannabis. And we try to look at it from a development or livelihoods lens rather than the dominant security or health lenses that already exist in the field of cannabis studies. Although you can't probably go without also having sort of some element of security or health-related issues that you want to look at. And then we also try to understand the consumption of cannabis, because a lot of the discussions about the legitimacy of cannabis as a crop or as a commodity of something that's used has to do with the cultures of consumption which are embedded in those different places that we study. So we are essentially, in terms of methodology, conducting interviews, in-depth interviews and ethnographic work in rural and urban areas in 4 select regions on the continent, to get a sense of what kind of meaning or role this crop and this good basically plays in Africa, or in these sites we study. And then the last thing, which initially was a kind of byproduct of our proposal when we first designed it actually, which was about drug policy, because we always wanted to know what the actual users and producers of cannabis make of their use and what it means to them. But because policy debates have sort of changed so quickly, and Ini mentioned the election campaign in Kenya, for example, that this element of our project has actually become much more important, that policy relevance, because countries are currently considering how to reform cannabis policies and actually make it work for their economies or for their countries. And I have to say that much of these discussions are very narrow, as Simon and Clemens will also probably mention, and are not really concerned with the broader livelihoods issues that we are interested in. But anyway, that's the project overview. If I could have my next slide. These are the countries or the regions we look at across the continent. They have very different histories. So southwestern Nigeria, the Eastern Cape in South Africa, Western Kenya, and southeastern Zimbabwe. Next slide, please. And they are also not only different historically in terms of their cannabis history or role, but also in terms of the legal status that cannabis has there. Nigeria and Kenya still considers cannabis an illegal substance, although there are debates about legalizing the drug. Zimbabwe and South Africa are slightly different in that respect. There, the medical and scientific use or production of cannabis for medical and scientific purposes is actually allowed or permitted. And in South Africa, there's even a further step that the private production for personal use is actually allowed. So, so personal production and personal use there is legal. It's very important to say, while there's these legal markets, there's a huge illegal market that still exists in all those 4 sites that sort of exist in parallel. And I think Clemens will talk about that as well. So last slide about Nigeria, very briefly. Next slide, please. So just to let you know a little bit about Nigeria, the focus in Nigeria is the southwest, the so-called Cocoa Belt, and Lagos as a sort of major urban center. And Nigeria has had a history of very repressive drug policy since the colonial period, and especially from the 1960s and in the 1980s, there were intensification of that policy. And cannabis was actually a major focal point for those repressive periods. In recent years, especially during the last election campaign, actually, there were some sort of voices that became public about making cannabis legal. But this, again, has been very focused on cannabis being an export crop, sort of being produced to export it abroad, because popular views on cannabis use are still very, very negative. So cannabis is seen as a major problem, especially recreational cannabis use, which is the major focus in debates. What we try to do in the project is go beyond sort of this focus on problematic recreational use and actually highlight that in urban areas, for example, there's a very important work dimension to cannabis use. It's used not only to work harder and work in sectors that are very hard, labor-oriented. And cannabis also provides livelihoods for urban traders, for example. And it plays an important role in countercultural discussions or narratives as well. If you think about Fela Kuti, for example, or more recently in Afrobeats music, where cannabis plays an important role to challenge the state and the crisis that exists. And in terms of rural history of cannabis, very little has been done on this before, so I can't really say too much about that yet anyway. But the idea is that since the 1970s and 80s, there was a diversification into cannabis, when other crops like cocoa were in decline. So we have some sort of idea that cannabis started to replace or compensate for the decline in cocoa, but and gain legitimacy as well at the time. But that's something that we will need to find out during research. So a lot of holes or gaps still to fill as part of the research. But I'll like to hand over to Simon for his part. And if you have any questions for me, then please put them in a chat or ask them at the end.
Thank you. Thanks, Gernot. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. So, I mean, South Africa specifically represents quite an opportunity in terms of both studying and understanding cannabis legislation, as it is one that is, currently in situ, or is currently changing as we speak. Cannabis legalization is, of course, a debate that's been going on in South Africa for quite a few years now, but has only really in the last 4 or 5 years actually become cemented in some sort of practical law or legislation. South Africa has a long history of cannabis use, but also cannabis restriction or cannabis policing. And I think, one can understand a lot of what has gone on in terms of cannabis legislation or anti-cannabis legislation in terms of the way in which it's been policed. Cannabis has, of course, there have been multiple ways in which cannabis has been regulated via whether it be sort of draconian policing activities or the spraying of crops and the sort of engagement with rural farmers and rural agriculturalists, so as that essentially a very prohibitionist and punitive policy arrangement came to play. And this has been detrimental on a number of fronts. I mean, I think, the policing of drugs in South Africa is one that, while it's occupied the national mindset for a very long time now, has been largely ineffective, and not only ineffective, but most likely actually counterproductive to the aims, at least, that were articulated in that type of policy framework. And so, there's been this movement towards taking the foot off the gas in terms of policing and attempting to regulate the industry or regulate cannabis production and use in more or less policing orientated manners. And the result of which has been, with the changing legislation, this sort of disparity between understanding what should be done in terms of regulation in South Africa and understanding who should be the principal players within South Africa in terms of a new industry or a legitimate industry. The regulations thus far have essentially decriminalized the use of cannabis for personal consumption and decriminalized the production of cannabis or the growth of cannabis plants for personal consumption. But this has been complicated by the fact that, personal consumption has never really been well defined in this context and is very difficult to define. So, I mean, the law has essentially been set up to understand that personal consumption and production would occur in a home with a wall around it. And of course, the majority of South African citizens don't live in places where there are defined walls or defined places and spaces. And so the policing of the drug or the substance rather has essentially further mirrored or further attenuated the differences within society that already exist. And we find this in policing often in terms of drugs and illicit goods, is that disparities that exist within a society may be magnified or further made critical by essentially the policing of a specific substance. And this has occurred both in terms of cannabis and other drugs here, is that essentially those who are already socially marginalized or economically excluded become further excluded by virtue of the policing tactics and policing activities that occur. And this not only marginalizes people, but also marginalizes, an entire livelihood, an entire way of being, an entire way of understanding a specific crop. So in South Africa, these are ongoing debates and things that represent an opportunity from a research perspective because they are ongoing and we have yet to find any form of real tangible conclusion to them. So, it's a very interesting and unique place to study and to understand the processes as they develop. Of course, there's also the economic concern around cannabis, and cannabis has been touted by many, including the government and indeed the president, as an economic, or could be an economic savior to the vast myriad of economic problems in the country. And while there's a lot of political lobbying and a lot of political hearsay at the moment seems to be done on the ground, which is of course a problem, because the primary people that have been policed by cannabis laws or who have felt the impact of cannabis laws have been rural, poor farmers, and thus far at least they have been largely left out of the conversation in terms of what the economic utility and the economic framework for the utility of cannabis might look like, which is of course problematic and continues the ongoing disparities that exist in society anyway. So the question of course is, how do we include rural farmers and rural livelihoods into both the debate, and indeed how do we include them into the legislation, so as that we can have a more just and democratic and equal framework, which empowers those who have previously been marginalized by policing and by the laws around cannabis, so as that they can benefit from any changes. And of course, in a country like South Africa, which is as divided as it is, and which has such large socioeconomic differences, simply encouraging or engaging with people so as to give them a voice is quite difficult. And one that I think that the research will focus on quite extensively here is that, in how do we engage with and encourage and develop people who have been previously marginalized, so as that they can engage with the sort of national debates and the national policy frameworks and the like. And of course, this is sort of an ongoing concern that has been a part of that has been under concern for a while now in South Africa. And there's an ongoing issue around how do we develop communities so as that cannabis can be of utility to that development, or how do we use cannabis as a means, an economic vehicle for developing specific communities. Thus far, at least, the attempts at commercialization and the economic use of cannabis as a crop have essentially become privatized and have been utilized primarily by private corporations, which have the money and the capacity to garner the licenses that are needed so as to be able to produce the crop at a commercial scale. And of course, this then begs the question of how do we engage with and how do we prevent the privatization of cannabis to such an extent that it is no longer accessible for small or agricultural, really rural farmers and individuals and small business owners. And of course, in South Africa, this is controlled by a very specific board known as SAPRO, which has a tendency, or at least in the past has display tendencies to up towards the person or the company that has the most money and is able to engage with and pay the licensing fees and deal with the technical issues in the most expedient manner. And of course, that again excludes small-time or small rural commercial farmers who wish to become commercial. So there's a whole load of debates and a whole range of issues in South Africa that present themselves when looking at cannabis. And I think that's what is unique about the topic, is that it allows us to engage with a whole range of diverse, both academically and economically and topically subject matters, so as to focus and provide a sort of analysis that looks at the intersection of these complex issues and provide something of a that has a policy or a practical application beyond academia, and which can hopefully inform changes in legislation and changes in policy conversations, so as that they themselves enact changes in people's lives, which inside the South African context are needed quite desperately in many instances. Thank you. I think that's done now.
Great. Thank you, Simon. We'll now have our last speaker, Clemens, take the mic. Thank you, Clemens, when you're ready.
Thank you, Ini, and good afternoon to all, and thank you once again for inviting me to be part of this exciting discussion. I'm going to give a brief presentation on Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is one of the countries that we're looking at in this project, alongside the two that you have just heard, and Kenya. So Zimbabwe also has got a long history of small producers as custodians of the cannabis plant and its knowledge. So by this, I mean that because the entry of corporations is a recent phenomenon. So for generations, cannabis was associated with the small producers. And for a long time also, it has been outlawed in line with international drug control policies. But since 2018, there have been some changes, or partly some changes, that is which legalized cannabis for medical and scientific purposes. But as my colleagues have indicated, the point that we are making and what we are seeing here is that this is a narrow framing of what is legal about cannabis, in the sense that the activities of many smallholders and traders, which go beyond the parameters of what is defined as medical and scientific production. They are not included, which include the production for as a means of livelihoods. It's not included, whether it's consumption. So that's what we mean by saying it's a narrow framing of what is legal about cannabis. And this has got implications for inclusivity and livelihoods. So what we are seeing in the case of Zimbabwe and even South Africa as well, which my colleague Simon has highlighted, is that while you have a legal market that has been created, but in narrow sense, focusing on production for medical and scientific purposes. So there's continued, it goes in parallel, it continues, there's continued decriminalization of production for anything that is considered to be for non-medical and scientific purposes, which include whether it's production for cultural purposes, consumption for cultural purposes, or for as a livelihood strategy. So that remains criminalized. So what I'm looking at now here, so that was just a few comments on Zimbabwe, but what I'm going to look at here, it doesn't apply to Zimbabwe alone. I think, as my colleague Simon has highlighted, this touches also on South Africa, even Lesotho, also if you want to look at Uganda as well. So what we are beginning to see with the potential profitability of the legal market that focus on medical and scientific purposes, then the entrance of new powerful players who are mostly big businesses. So they are becoming the major beneficiaries. So here we are seeing that, as my colleague Simon has highlighted in the context of South Africa, that the licenses that are issued, they are mainly to these agribusiness, not smallholder producers, because of the high entry costs. For instance, in Zimbabwe, to acquire a permit for to produce legally, the minimum you can pay is $5,000 US, ranging up to as high as $50,000 US, depending on the nature of the business, at what level you are entering, whether it's for research purposes, whether it's for just production, whether also there's an export permit. And this comes also with the annual fees that have to be paid as well. And also even the renewal costs also are very expensive. So this become part of some of the barriers, especially for many of the poor who would be interested or who have a history of association or having livelihoods that are linked to cannabis. So small producers are unable to satisfy many other conditions for this new industry, the medical and scientific sector. And we have seen examples of protests geared or directed towards this issue about the pricing of the permits and the issuing, the processes, and all these conditions around the new industry. We have seen protests in Malawi in November 2020, and last year in April, there were also protests in South Africa against the challenges with accessing permits for the legal cannabis production. So what are the implications for livelihoods and the development? So what we are seeing here is that there is a real risk of corporate capture of the cannabis industry. So if you look, for example, in Zimbabwe, the kind of players that are going there, and in tandem with the presidency, Zimbabwe is open for business mantra. So you will find that there is limited role or even effort to mainstream smallholder producers and traders into the legal cannabis industry. So this and what we are seeing, or another implication here, is this emergence of a dual model or dual agrarian structure in the cannabis sector, where on one hand you have the legal cannabis sector, which is dominated by agribusinesses, but also getting state support and benefiting also from agricultural policies, whether it's incentives and the like. But alongside that, there's this continued and subdued criminalization of activities of smallholder producers, traders, and consumers, and this invisibilization of this market dominated by the illegal market dominated by small producers, which and the invisibilization has got effect that they cannot be able to benefit from agrarian policies, whether it's even if land is made available for cannabis producer, they cannot be considered because it's illegal anyway. And if you want to come out that I have been producing cannabis, and then you risk being arrested, but at the same time, so these are some of the challenges that we are seeing. This dual model that is emerging, and a super model for those who have resources, and those who don't have resources continuing to operate on the sidelines. So, and the other implication here is that about the perpetration of violence that have been going on for generations against the smallholder producers, because as long as their production is it remains criminalized, then it means that their participation in this legal market, and also the relationship with the state, it doesn't change much, because their production is too viewed as a problematic production that is feeding into drug abuse, drug addiction, and all that, while the new market with the bigger players who pay taxes and contribute to state revenue, they continue to be viewed favorably. So there are policy implications here for that invisibilization of historical cannabis-linked livelihoods. So what I'm saying is that livelihoods that have historically been there, and a substance, a crop that has been contributing to livelihoods of some, it remains invisibilized. And to policymakers, it doesn't exist, and it's seen as a problematic, and that is causing some problems. So we are saying that there are some challenges here for not only for policymakers, but for all of us who are interested in studying about cannabis in Africa, and also in countries like Zimbabwe and South Africa, where there are some changes that are taking place, but that do not go long enough. So the challenge here is, how do we create an inclusive legal cannabis industry? And secondly, how do we ensure equitable distribution of benefits in the legal cannabis industry? And the position that is being taken by governments like that of Zimbabwe at the moment is the view that there is going to be a trickle-down effect where taxes that come from the big industry players, the agribusiness and the like, are going to be channeled towards the development of society. But this is not a new thing. We have seen this in other industry, whether it's mining, whether it's a conventional agriculture, cash crops and the like, that this is an approach that does not work. And so the challenge of inclusivity becomes a an issue here. So ensuring the participation of smallholders in shaping cannabis policy to respond to their needs, I think is a challenge. I think Simon has highlighted this also in South Africa, especially for those in the rural areas, because in Zimbabwe, unlike compared to South Africa is a little better of organization in terms of social movements that try to mobilize small producers. But in Zimbabwe, doesn't have that kind of preparedness or even the kind of mobilization that we see, for example, in South Africa. So the risk here of this new imposition of a new model dominated by agribusiness going on unchallenged, I think it's something that is of concern. But there are also implications for agrarian policy and transformation, like I have indicated. How do you make sure that this model or this industry that is emerging, the legal industry, is going to ensure enough participation on the ground to ensure that all or many people are going to benefit from this production, from this industry. So I think these are some of the implications that we see with regard to not only Zimbabwe, South Africa, but also other countries like Uganda, for example, where there's only one agribusiness that has been licensed to produce for medical and scientific purposes. With that, I thank you so much. I hand over to Eni.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Clemens. And at this point, I'd like to call upon our discussant, Max, who will offer his reflections on all of the three presentations, while also flagging the issue of taxation and also speaking a bit about the research that he has recently begun on this topic. Max, over to you. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint. I just have my notes, of which I hope I can still decipher some of them. I mean, first of all, thank you to Eni and Shireen for having me, and thank you for all the speakers. It's been an absolute pleasure to get a little view ahead at this fascinating set of research projects, which I mean look incredibly promising and fascinating. And one of the things I really liked about the presentation so far is that they start out with the history and practice of cannabis usage and production in Africa today. It seems like, and not just its future. I mean, it seems like we sit at an odd little point in time. On the one hand, it is easy to read about an enormous hype about the potential developmental economic possibilities of cannabis in Africa, while at the same time the effects of its current criminalization across most of the continent are still very, very keenly felt by a lot of people. So I really like that this project seems to kind of situate the practice of it and the practice of it today and its historical practice as a way kind of to bridge the ways in which there seems to be often a projection into the future without an account of its past. So I really, really like that, and the project kind of takes that starting point and thinks both about the kind of the immediate and the more long-term future. One of the things I really, really enjoyed about the presentations today was that they seem to unpack a little bit some of the unclear borders and potentially the purposefully unclear borders in how we talk about cannabis in Africa today. I mean, there's a distinction between medical and recreational cannabis. There's the distinction between personal and non-personal use, between growth for personal use or growth for distribution, and so on. And if we look at not just Africa, but more globally today, it is very easy to see that these distinctions start breaking down. But also it's easy to trace that these distinctions are imbued with notions of power, that they are weaponized for the interest of some over others. And it was really interesting to see that coming out in these presentations, as well as also, I think this kind of focus on livelihoods was really strong, and it presented a powerful counterpoint, not just to the security lens that is so often used, but also as I think a really, really good starting point to start informing debates about the legal framework and kind of put this livelihood as a context to thinking about the legal frameworks that are often still in development. So thank you so much for this. It was an absolute pleasure, and I'm really looking forward to continuing to watch these projects unfold. Maybe I have two questions for the the speakers to maybe think about in the little time that we have left. I do think we're running out of time a little bit. And I think the first is about international influences. So there's been a lot of discussions in the presentation so far about the colonial impacts and histories which have shaped the criminalization of these drugs in the past, which has shaped their trade and production. And there's been a discussion of the way in which larger commercial players in a domestic context have, gotten the bigger licenses and have shaped the production. But I think thinking a little bit more about how modern global structures, how international actors, global perception of cannabis, the legalization of it in the US and Canada, but also international capital are shaping these developments, I think would be an interesting thing to think about a little bit. And the second question to think about, I think, would be, what are the models we are looking to? I think there's been a really interesting discussion on the models we're worried about. There's been analogy to cash crops, but also to mining, to various other models which we've seen where smaller producers have been left behind and which have been less inclusive, as Clemens pointed out, than we would have liked. So I think thinking a little bit about, okay, we know which models we don't want, but which models are we looking towards for building these markets? And maybe those questions are informed a little bit by the work we started to do around cannabis taxation at the International Center for Tax and Development, where I work. This work is very much kind of in a very, very early stage, but it started from the realization that a lot of the thinking around taxation of cannabis has been dramatically shaped by the experience of the US and Canada, which have seen that states can extract quite a substantial amount of tax revenue from this. California is often cited that collected over $300 million from cannabis production. Colorado and Washington collected up to 1% of their state revenue through cannabis. But that seems like these discussions are quite far removed from the perspective we need to take when we think about the legalization and taxing of cannabis in the African context. And I think that our starting point there, and I think it sits quite nicely with the discussions of the Cannabis Africana project that was presented here, was that we really need to think about this as the creation of a new market and as a legal structure that has influences on a variety of people across the value chain, and not just as a sin tax in a consumption-dominated context, but we really need to think about it from the production to the consumption. And especially if we think about countries like Morocco, considering the legalization of cannabis, we need to think about production and export, and production for export, and not just for a domestic context. So that really then places taxation into this wider discussion that I think Clemens framed really powerfully about how do we create a new market? What are the models we look for creating a new market that is both inclusive, but also productive for the countries involved? So for our thinking there, it really is moving away from thinking about this as a small scale, quick gain, sin tax kind of situation, and thinking about the larger market creation and the constraints that come with it. So 3 constraints to really briefly mention here. I think one is, even in a legalizing context, the continuing existence of an illegal market. Which, I mean, again, in the US and Canadian and a variety of other contexts, we have seen that the creation of a legal market does not make illegal markets go away. So thinking about it, creating a legal market that sits alongside that illegal market and how these two interact, I think is really, really critical. I think the second is thinking about this as a matter of industrial policy. So Morocco is currently, or has long been, one of the largest producers of cannabis in the world, has been one of the largest suppliers of the European market. That being said, it is now competing with producers in places like the US and Canada in markets where it is legalized and where it is very, very aggressively, heavily capitalized, which can lead to different genetic strains, can lead to different growing conditions. And so it is also entering, if we think about this as a global consumption market at some point, into a kind of industrial policy field where we need to think about global competition, we need to think about research and development, we need to think about capital accumulation and the markets in which traditional producers can present themselves. And the third part, and that largely stands in tension with the second point, really is equity. And I think Clemens again brought that out really, really nicely, which is that if we think about the obvious analogies to here, and aside from cash crops, I would add things like oil as analogies here for the context of goods in which there's been a heavy amount of state regulation and a certain export focus. These are often at a very, very substantial risk of capture. And that could be through national, highly capitalized interests or internationally capitalized interests. So I think thinking a little bit more about how we structure these markets going forward, what the models are to avoid that capture and to find room for smaller domestic producers, and thinking about what the role of taxation can be in that is the question going forward. So I'm really looking forward to keeping in touch with the authors of the Cannabis Africana project and continuing these questions going forward. So thank you very much for having me, and I will wrap up here.
Brilliant. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your reflections with us, Max. At this point, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to the speakers and our discussant, and would like to now open up the floor for questions. If you have any questions, bearing of course in mind that we're suffering from a paucity of time availability, just feel free to pop the questions in the Q&A box, or you could use the raise hand function, and we'll call on you to ask your questions. Of course, please try to keep them as brief as you possibly can. I will, of course, take advantage of my chair privileges, and I'll use that to pose the first question to our speakers. And my own question is: are there any success stories in terms of countries with policies worth emulating where the protection of cannabis-dependent rural livelihoods is concerned? Also, sorry, we've got another question in the Q&A box, so I think I'll just I'll throw that question at our speakers as well, and we'll then give you some time to think about that while we take any other questions that other attendees might have. And the other question is the cannabis in Africa for domestic use, or does it also go internationally? This person's asking, do we encounter any challenges against the legal cannabis industry from international organizations? Does anyone else have any other questions, or do we let our speakers answer the first couple? Okay, Gannett, it looks like you're raising your hand. Would you like to go?
Yeah, sorry about that. So thank you very much for the questions, and thanks, Max, for your comments. I think it might be worth we actually have a discussion about some of them, because I think they are really fascinating. Maybe to answer very briefly your question, Ini, and link it to Max's one, do we have any models? At the moment, not yet, I think, at least in the African context, that models where we would have a more equitable setup of legalizing cannabis. But I think the Moroccan example is a good one. While it's not a country that we actually look at as part of the project, there have been some signs that there is a different setup of how that market is being created there, where you actually have the involvement of small holder producers in a kind of marketing board setup, where they sell to a state board, and then the state will send onwards to the international market, which is quite different, I think, from the Southern African examples that we have heard of. So there's some examples where I think you have a market set up for slightly different purposes. And I also agree with Max on the issue of tax. If this is discussed as a kind of often in Nigeria, at least, as a very sort of, the benefit would be very quick, and a lot of benefits would be gained by taxing all that money from cannabis production. I think whereas the question is really, how do you create a market or a system where you provide for the livelihoods of the many people that are already involved in this market illegally? And that's a much bigger issue to solve. And I think it's not just about export earnings and taxation as well, actually. But I'll leave it at that for now. Maybe hand over to my colleagues if they want to answer some of those questions.
Right, thank you. Would any other member of our speaking panel want to add anything to what Gannett's just said?
Just in relation to the second question, one of the things about the sort of internationalization of cannabis, ironically, is, if we think of examples of cannabis being exported from South Africa, one of the best examples, or from Southern Africa, one of the best examples is actually the illegal trade. and Swazi Gold, for instance, where, I mean, I'm sure many people in the UK have heard of Swazi Gold. And of course, while the way in which it's done may not be legal, I mean, you know, there are lessons to be learned there about how internationalization can be achieved and how it can impact on local farmers and local production and local livelihoods ultimately. You know, this distinction, the sharp distinction, at least, between the legal and the illegal is one that is made primarily from the place of the law itself. And, you know, there is a lot that can be learned from either side, ultimately, I think, in terms of looking at ways in which cannabis can be internationalized, or that the local production of cannabis can be useful and can benefit local farmers, even when it's taken overseas. Thanks.
Super. Thank you, Simon. We've got time just for one very brief question. If there's anyone else who's got any questions they'd like to pose to our speakers, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? Okay, if not, Shireen, are you raising your hand?
Yes, I've got a very quick question. It's very much related to what Max mentioned, which I thought was very interesting. That question of the coexistence between the legal and the illegal market. And I was wondering if we could hear a little bit more from our speakers about their thoughts on, you know, how that can be addressed from a policy perspective. How does that coexistence work, and what does that mean for the broader question around livelihoods? Over to you.
Can I come in, Eni?
Yes, you can, Clemens, please.
All right. Thank you so much. I think it's an important question regarding the coexistence between the legal and the illegal. I think the first thing we should do, the first point we should note is that the illegal market, it's illegal in as far as the state laws have made it illegal, but they have failed to wash it away and for generations. And I think that links to the question by Max regarding what models can we move towards. I think the point is that what we are seeing is that illegality, the question we should ask ourselves, whether illegality, by illegalizing cannabis, this has helped or is even any beneficial to the state, to the authorities themselves. To me, it seems as if it's not working. Maybe actually making it illegal can help them to be able to deal with the people not hiding, but being able to create maybe markets. So when you make it illegal, then you are able to help people to move towards whether if there are any standards that need to be achieved for them to be able to participate in the legal market. I think you are able to help them. I think an example is contract farming in the cash crop sector, for example, tobacco, where small producers and the agribusinesses are able to work together through contract farming, and you are able also to transfer even capacity and knowledge from those who have it, which could be agribusinesses, and it could go the other way. So I think the issue is smallholder producers and traders. They are also interested in making, in maximizing the value of the crop that they are producing. And for that to happen, it cannot happen by trying to force them to fit into a narrow framework which is highly technical and highly costly, which is very costly, and say, come and fit here. I think it's like giving a Ferrari car to a farmer, and you want them to make better use of that Ferrari car in a farm. The next, that you will achieve is that you will find it having broken down, because you are giving them a wrong tool, a wrong model to work with. So I think the issue is not that we should subdue them, but it's how do we, I think a good example here is Bolivia with the coca producers, the cooperatives in the rural areas, where Evo Morales tried, instead of trying to control them, come heavy-handed, was to try to make sure that production takes place in the cooperatives there, and try to put mechanisms to limit the leakages from these cooperatives into maybe the cartels and other things. So I think this could be the way for us to go.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you for that, Clemens. At this point, I'm afraid we've run out of time. So I'd like to thank all of our attendees, everyone, for joining us for this NatCen International webinar event. Thank you so much for your time. Of course, my immense thanks as well to all of our speakers, Gernot Klanschneck, Simon Howell, Clemens Shosenga, thank you. To our discussant, Simon Howell, thank you as well. To my colleagues here at NatCen International, Shereen Altaribolsi McCarthy, Conor Riche, thank you. Also, and of course, to all the members of the communications team for helping us put this together and making it work. Thank you all as well. And I believe that this is just the beginning of a much longer series of conversations that we will hopefully continue to have around some of the issues that we've raised today. And also, of course, we're very much looking forward to the outputs from the Cannabis Africana project. No pressure, of course, Gernot and the team. Thank you, everyone, and see you all hopefully soon. Take care. Bye.